We all know that the marital act is wrong because we don't do it in public, just like pooping. I've been picking on St. Thomas Aquinas a little bit recently, highlighting some of his takes that I find to be pretty revolting. Specifically, I was talking about his views that those in heaven will rejoice at the suffering of those in hell, and his view that raptus is not as bad of a sin as solo acts. Link to those videos in the description below. But I think it's time that I let poor Thomas off the hook and I pick on somebody else. This is a video about some of the really weird teachings from St. Augustine of Hippo regarding sex. Augustine thought that the marital act causes men to suspend all mental activity. For this reason, it would be better if we could procreate without the marital act. And actually, holy men of former times were able to perform the marital act without any joy in the act of itself, and the only joy that they found was in the production of the offspring. And actually, before the fall, everyone would have been like that. Nobody would have had to experience any joy in the act itself. Carnal concupiscence would have been absent, as Augustine called it. And then lastly, we all know that the marital act is wrong because we don't do it in public, just like pooping. To be clear, these teachings are not viewed as binding by the overwhelming majority of Catholics, including the official rule-setting Catholics like Pope Francis and Prefect Fernandez, the current head of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. I highly doubt that a single ordained minister in the Catholic Church would say that any of the teachings I'm about to discuss are binding. So why even talk about this stuff? Well, two reasons. First, there are some people, some laity, who do believe that these teachings are binding, at least to some extent. Again, not clergy, not any clergyman that I know of, just laity. But take this guy, for example, who was a recent guest on the Uncharted Catholic Man podcast. When Craig, the host, was trying to tell the guest that indeed the church does view natural family planning as a licit form of birth control, indeed the only licit form, the guest said, "Nope, the church was wrong when she said that NFP is licit, because whatever the church said first is correct."
How do we know which is which then?
You have to go back to tradition. Whatever was said before it must line up. And then you go back to the Bible. So this is how the church doesn't err. However, there's modernism in there, and modernism can trick everybody. Like Father Ripperger, he's right about this. He says, we're living in very heretical times.
And then 7 minutes later, the guest says that we don't get to change tradition.
But if the church says the sin of Onan was lest children reborn, right there from the Bible, and that's the tradition, then that's it. We don't get to change it.
So some people definitely do think that some of this stuff is binding to some degree. Link to that full episode below. Now, this guy, the guest on the Uncharted Catholic Man podcast, also doesn't think that marital raptus is a thing that is even possible. It doesn't exist. He attends the FSSP, the traditionalist organization that I grew up in. So this guy is not representative of your average Catholic. But there's a more pressing reason that I want to review these teachings from St. Augustine. I find an attitude among certain Catholics that we owe the benefit of the doubt to the teachings, especially the moral teachings, of the titans who came before us. I'm talking about here about the fathers of the church and the doctors of the church, saints like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, etc. But I say that the giants who came before us, they were right when they were right, and they were wrong when they were wrong, just like anyone else. And I would encourage my Catholic viewers to read the saints and the church fathers with the same skepticism with which they read Protestant works or secular works. All of that being said, nothing that I say here will prove that the church is false or challenge any practicing Catholic in any real way. Just like in my Aquinas videos, I'm just trying to show you some non-binding teachings that I find, well, I guess in Aquinas' case, revolting. In Augustine's case, I don't know if I find this revolting or just kind of really silly and odd. Revolting to some extent, maybe. I'll let you judge. But because in some trad circles you'll find sympathies for these kinds of attitudes, I think that this is a worthwhile discussion to have. I will start with a very brief introduction to St. Augustine. St. Augustine is a saint in the Roman Catholic Church as well as in the Orthodox Church and the Anglican Church. Specifically in the Catholic Church, St. Augustine is considered a doctor of the Church thanks to all of his writings. When St. Augustine was a young man, he was a party boy, but he changed his ways, and he wrote about his change of ways in a book called Confessions. Perhaps his most famous work, though, is City of God, and I will be quoting from City of God to explain Augustine's views on sexuality. Notably as well, St. Augustine was writing in Latin and is probably one of the most preeminent figures when you think about Catholic saints writing in Latin, right? So there's St. Jerome, and then there's probably St. Augustine right after that. I think that's all of the background that you're going to need on St. Augustine, so with that, let's jump into it. First, St. Augustine wrote that the marital act causes men to suspend all mental activity. He wrote about this in the City of God. This is page 371 of the PDF that I have of the City of God, but it's chapter 16 of book 14. Let's read. Lust may have many objects, yet when no object is specified, the word lust usually suggests to the mind the lustful excitement of the organs of generation. So when Augustine writes about lust, all he's talking about is the excitement of the organs of generation. That's going to be important to remember because I think that sometimes a modern audience will reinterpret what lust meant to somebody like Augustine, but Augustine is fairly clear here. Lust just means you getting excited, you enjoying the marital act. That's going to be lustful, according to Augustine. And this lust not only takes possession of the whole body and outward members, but also makes itself felt within and moves the whole man with a passion in which mental emotion is mingled with bodily appetite, so that the pleasure which results is the greatest of all bodily pleasures. Right here, I want to say, don't get me wrong, it's great. Greatest? I think that there are things that I enjoy more, but okay. So possessing indeed is this pleasure that at the moment of time in which it is consummated, all mental activity is suspended. So possessing indeed is this pleasure. So possessing, it possesses you so much that all mental activity is suspended. If you ask me, this sounds like Augustine is writing about people who can't control themselves, kind of. And I think that this sounds a lot kind of like some like modern apologists for Raptus, people who say like, oh, well, you know, did you see what she was wearing? I couldn't control myself, stuff like that. That kind of seems to be the attitude that Augustine takes as well. Men get so possessed by the idea that all mental activity is suspended. That doesn't happen to me. I don't become like a machine that can't stop once you turn it on. And I think that that's a personal problem if that's how you are. Like, if you can't stop once you start, I think that you need to work on that. But anyway, Augustine goes on here. If we keep reading a little bit longer, we will see that Augustine clearly thinks that enjoying the marital act at all is wrong. Let's keep reading. What friend of wisdom and holy joy, who, being married, but knowing, as the apostle says, how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, not in the disease of desire, as the Gentiles who know God, would not prefer, if this were possible, to beget children without this lust? And remember, lust just means... The word lust usually suggests to mind the excitement of the organs of generation. So, what friend of wisdom and holy joy would not prefer to beget children without the excitement of the organs of generation? So that, in this function of begetting offspring, the members created for this purpose should not be stimulated by the heat of lust, but should be actuated by his volition, in the same way as his other members serve him for their respective ends. So, what holy person doesn't just wish that the act, the marital act, couldn't be very similar to, for instance, like doing manual labor, like doing construction? Like, sure, we use the organs that were designed for construction when we swing a hammer and all that, those organs being our hands when we swing a hammer. What holy person doesn't desire that procreating with your spouse was exactly the same? What holy person doesn't wish that they didn't enjoy procreation? I imagine that I've already sufficiently made my point that Augustine thinks that the marital act, like by itself, is like not great because, you know, you enjoy it and like that's bad. And I think I demonstrated that with the last quote from City of God, but I'm going to move over to Augustine's On Marriage and Concupiscence, Book 1, Chapter 19, to just really drive this point home. Augustine in Chapter 19 talks about what the blessings of matrimony are. And he says that the blessings of matrimony are offspring, that's self, you know, that makes sense, fidelity, and the sacramental bond. And what does he mean by the sacramental bond? Does he mean like the marital act? No, he says the sacramental bond, which is lost neither by divorce nor adultery, should be guarded by the husband and wife with concord and chastity, for it alone is that which even an unfruitful marriage retains by the law of piety, now that all that hope of fruitfulness is lost for the purpose of which the couple married. So I think what he's saying there is the sacramental bond is sacramental. I think it's spiritual. I don't think that he's talking about anything physical in the sacramental bond there. And then he ends this chapter by saying, carnal concupiscence, however, must not be ascribed to marriage. It is only to be tolerated in marriage. It is not a good which comes out of the essence of marriage, but an evil, which is the accident of original sin. So this carnal concupiscence, this enjoyment of the marital act, is an evil, which is only an accident of original sin. Enjoyment of the marital act is not part of the essence of marriage. Procreation is, but it would be better if everyone could procreate without actually enjoying. To demonstrate the belief that Augustine held that holy men of former times were actually able to perform the marital act without any joy in the act itself, but only in the fact that they were producing offspring, I am going to go to Augustine's Sermons on Selected Lessons of the New Testament. I am on page 428 in the copy of this text that I have, and I'm going to read from the bottom of page 428 to the top of page 429. In that other duty of marriage, sensual men seek for wives only to satisfy their sensuality, and therefore at length are scarce content even with their wives. And oh, I would that if they cannot or will not cure their sensuality, they would not suffer it to go beyond that limit which conjugal duty prescribes. I mean, even that which is granted to infirmity. Nevertheless, if you were to say to such a man, "Why do you marry?" he would answer, perhaps for very shame, "For the sake of children." But if anyone in whom he could have unhesitating credit were to say to him, "God is able to give, and yea, and will give you children without your having any intercourse with your wife," he would assuredly be driven to confess that it was not for the sake of children that he was seeking a wife. Let him then acknowledge his infirmity, and so receive that which he pretended to receive only as a matter of duty. So you might ask somebody, says St. Augustine, "Why do you marry?" And that person will say, "Well, to have kids." But this guy is a liar, says St. Augustine. This guy is weak. He actually wants to have marital relations with his wife. If you asked him, and he was forced to be honest, "Hey, you guess what? Things have changed, and now you can actually have kids without any marital union with your wife. Isn't that great?" This person wouldn't be happy. They would be upset, because that would mean that they shouldn't be doing that with their wife anymore. They should just be like having kids without having any intercourse. And Augustine here is saying, like, look at this poser. He thinks that he's holy, but he actually likes to have sex with his wife. So how holy can he be, says St. Augustine. It was thus those holy men of former times, those men of God, sought and wished for children. Because they were holy, they wished for children. For this one end, the procreation of children, was their intercourse and union with their wives. It is for this reason that they were allowed to have a plurality of wives. For if immoderateness in these desires could be well-pleasing to God, it would have been as such allowed at that time for one woman to have many husbands, as one husband many wives. Why then had all the chaste women no more than one husband, but one man had many wives? Except that for one man to have many wives is a means to the multiplication of a family, whereas a woman would not give birth to more children, how many soever more husbands she might have. Wherefore, brethren, if our fathers' union and intercourse with their wives was for no other end than the procreation of children, it had been a great matter of joy to them if they could have had children without that intercourse, since for the sake of having them they descended to that intercourse only through duty, and did not rush into it through lust. The men of old would have loved to have big families without having intercourse. Unfortunately, they couldn't have big families without intercourse, so they did have intercourse, and they had many wives because they wanted a lot of children, but they wanted to, like, I guess, min-max the children to intercourse ratio. Like, they wanted to have the most children with the least amount of intercourse, so they needed a whole bunch of wives. You see, it's very practical, you see. This should sound crazy to everybody. It sounds crazy to me. Next up, we have the belief that before the fall, there was no carnal concupiscence. There was no enjoyment of the marital act. To demonstrate that Augustine did hold this view, I go to On Marriage and Concupiscence, Book 2, Chapter 26. That concupiscence, that carnal concupiscence, however, which we have to be ashamed of, and the shame of which has given to our secret members their shameful designation, pudenda, that's, I think, a Latin phrase for the shameful designation, I suppose, had no existence in the body during its life in paradise before the entrance of sin. But it began to exist in the body of this death after sin, the rebellion of the members retaliating man's disobedience. Without this concupiscence, it was quite possible to affect the function of the wedded pair in the procreation of children, just as many a laborious work is accomplished by the compliant operation of other limbs, without any lascivious heat, for they are simply moved by the direction of the will, not excited by the ardor of concupiscence. So what Augustine is saying here is that before the fall, procreation would have been like any other act of manual labor, where you don't get all excited about it, you just kind of do it because you will it to be done, and then it happens. And that's the way it's supposed to be. That's better, and that's how it was before the fall, according to Augustine. And lastly, and this is my favorite one, Augustine talks about the shame which attends all sexual intercourse. This is my favorite because of just how silly it is. I'm just going to read this to you directly as it's stated. And this comes from City of God. So this is actually the exact same place that we were before, just 2 pages later. So I'm on page 373 in the City of God, at least in the one that I have. This is chapter 18 of book 14. And chapter 18 is called Of the Shame Which Attends All Sexual Intercourse. Lust requires for its consummation darkness and secrecy, and this not only when unlawful intercourse is desired, but even such fornication as the earthly city has legalized. So Augustine is saying that all intercourse is done in secret, not just cheating, but like even sex between a husband and a wife is done in secret. Why? Because there's something inherent about sexuality that makes it shameful. Where there is no fear of punishment, these permitted pleasures still shrink from the public eye. Even where provision is made for this lust, secrecy also is provided. And while lust found it easy to remove prohibitions of law, shamelessness found it impossible to lay aside the veil of retirement. For even shameless men call this shameful, and though they love the pleasure, they dare not display it. What? Does not even conjugal intercourse, sanctioned as it is by law for the propagation of children, legitimate and honorable though it may be, does it not seek retirement from every eye? Before the bridegroom fondles his bride, does he not exclude the attendants, even the paranymphs and such friends as his closest ties have admitted to the bridal chamber? The greatest master of Roman eloquence says that all right actions wish to be set in the light. They desire to be known. This right action, however, has such a desire to be known that yet it blushes to be seen. Who does not know what passes between husband and wife that children may be born? Is it not for this purpose that wives are married with such ceremony? And yet, when this well-understood act is gone about for the procreation of children, not even the children themselves, who may already have been born to them, are suffered to be witnesses. All of that was very eloquent, but it's just, hey, look, you don't let your kids see you doing this. You don't let your closest friends see you doing this. Why? Because it's inherently shameful. This right action seeks the light insofar as it seeks to be known, yet it dreads being seen. And why so, if not because that which is fitting, that which is by nature fitting and decent, is so done as to be accompanied with a shame-begetting penalty of sin. Wow. Okay. So we don't let anybody see us do the marital stuff with our spouses because it is shame begetting, and the enjoyment of it is it's a shame begetting penalty of sin. Now, I don't think that Augustine literally thinks that it's a sin to enjoy it, but he definitely thinks that it's like a vice. And I alluded to this at the beginning, but like, I wonder if he thinks about pooping this the same way, right? Like, I know it's silly, but we don't let other people watch us poop either. And nobody thinks that it's shameful to poop. Like, I just find this whole thing so silly. Like, the fact that Augustine thinks that this is like a serious argument, I think is something that is silly. I don't know. I think it's silly. I think that he's a product of his time. And I think that this is the best example of Augustine being a product of his time. That's all. This video is primarily about St. Augustine, but just to show you that I really do think St. Augustine is like a product of his time, let's look at a contemporary of St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom. St. John Chrysostom is kind of like the Greek version. Like, Augustine is Latin and St. John Chrysostom is Greek. I think St. John Chrysostom was born after Augustine and died before Augustine. So they were contemporaries, just to show you that both in like the Latin church and in the Greek church of the late 4th, early 5th century, this was kind of just a common understanding. I'd like to briefly show you something that St. John Chrysostom said about marriage and about the marital union. So St. John Chrysostom in his sermon on marriage says, "Marriage was not instituted for wantonness or for fornication, but for chastity." And that's interesting that he says marriage was not instituted for fornication. Does he consider what married couples do to be fornication? Listen to what Paul says. "Because of the temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. These are the two purposes for which marriage was instituted, to make us chaste and to make us parents." And then I'm just gonna skip ahead here. "So there remains only one reason for marriage, to avoid fornication, and the remedy is offered for this purpose." St. John Chrysostom seems pretty clear that marriage is not about the marital union at all. The marital union, that act, is necessary for the creation of children, and so fine, you have to do it. But the real purpose of marriage is to procreate and to be chaste, not to have relations with your wife. So John Chrysostom seems to agree with Augustine that having relations with your wife is not virtuous at all. In fact, it's probably a vice, but perhaps a necessary one. You probably noticed that St. John Chrysostom quoted from Paul in his sermon on marriage. Even though both Augustine and John Chrysostom were writing some 350 years after Paul was, Paul writes some pretty similar things when we compare their writings. Paul, for instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, writes the following. He says, "Each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband." But he says this as a concession, not a command, and that he wishes that everyone was celibate like him. He just acknowledges that not everyone can be celibate as him. But to the unmarried and to the widows, he says it is good for them to stay unmarried, as he does. It is better to remain celibate, in other words, than it is for you to give in to your carnal concupiscence. But if you must give in to your carnal concupiscence because you're not as strong as Paul, fine, but limit your carnal concupiscence to being expressed only within the confines of marriage. But it's still clear that Paul thinks one is better than the other. Protestants are able to look at Augustine's and John Chrysostom's views on sex and just laugh, right? Protestants, by and large, don't really seem like they owe any allegiance to any of the saints. Catholics probably wouldn't laugh. They respect, Saints Augustine and John Chrysostom, but they can still kind of just wring their hands and say, yeah, well, they were products of their time, and even though we respect them greatly, we just disagree with them here, and none of their writings are binding anyway. And yes, that's true. But neither the Protestant nor the Catholic can say the same things about the writings of Paul. They can't say the same thing about 1 Corinthians. Paul's letters are sacred scripture. I think that some modern Christians have the exact same attitude about sex that I do. Maybe not the exact same, but generally speaking the same, which is a secular view. It's thoroughly secular. And I think that those kinds of Christians, the people who share similar views that I do, kind of hand wave away the writings of the saints, of St. Augustine and St. John Chrysostom. But I think it's a lot harder to hand wave away the writings of St. Paul. So I might push those Christians and tell them, you can't really hand wave away Augustine without also hand waving away Paul. Paul and Augustine seem to agree. And some Christians will react to me pushing on them this way by going full trad mode. Augustine was right, just deal with it. That kind of thing. But others, like me, might start to view both Augustine and Paul as being products of their time, both of whom I am freely able to reject if I disagree with their attitudes. And I don't know, I just kind of see a little bit of cognitive dissonance in dismissing Augustine, but not dismissing Paul about the same issue. Thanks for watching.